Well, joining me now is UVM Extension agronomist Heather Darby. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
How far along is your research, and how long before farmers can really produce a lot of grains?
Well, we've been conducting variety tries for a couple of years. It's relatively new research that we're doing. And I think, there are a number of farmers in Vermont that have been growing wheat specifically for 20 to 30 years. So it's not a new concept. I think UVM Extension is putting more emphasis on trying to help those producers and new producers that have the potential to come into the market.
What kind of nutrient requirements does wheat need to grow?
It's, well, it's relatively low when you compare it to corn. It's probably, I would say a little bit less than half of what corn needs for nutrients. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's works well in the rotations that we have here in Vermont, crop rotations.
And so when is wheat harvested, and what challenges does the weather present?
Yeah. The wheat is seeded in the fall or in the spring, mm-hmm. and depending on what wheat you're growing, it's harvested at a slightly different time. Generally, we're harvesting in late July for winter seeded grains, and then early August for the spring seeded grains. But this year, there's still people out there struggling to get the crop in, and it's almost September. Mm-hmm. So it's not an easy task, very difficult.
It's been so wet.
It's been so wet, and generally we can rely on July or end of July and August to be relatively dry. We used to sort of get a lot of our rain in the early summers, but now that seems to be shifting a little bit, and so it makes it even more difficult to get a grain harvest in. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so once it's harvested, then you got to mill it.
Yeah, once the grain is harvested, you generally have to dry it nowadays because it's difficult to get the grain out of the field at the right moisture that it needs to be stored at. So it needs to be stored at 12% moisture. And coming off the fields most of the time, it's above that. So first it needs to be properly dried and cleaned.
And how does that, is that a machine that does that? Or?
Yeah, there's a couple of different types of dryers or machines or bins. We see a lot of grain bins on dairy farms. Generally that grain's brought in from someplace else. But so it would be a similar bin, and it would have a blower in it that would force air up through the grain and dry it out. And then once it's dry, a farmer might sell it to a commercial mill, or they might try to mill it on their own farm. Several farms do that, and that requires another special piece of equipment. So
for a farmer who wanted to get into this, there'd be a significant investment.
Yeah, like I had mentioned in the video, the infrastructure is really lacking. We mostly have sort of forage infrastructure because we have a lot of dairy farms, and the infrastructure for grain is relatively, well, it's very different. Combines, grain dryers, grain bins, and then processing equipment on a farm if you want to process the grain yourself.
Do you foresee a commercial grain mill being established in Vermont? I mean, is there enough grain being grown, wheat being grown?
There isn't at this time. There's a couple of commercial mills, one in New York and one in Quebec, mm-hmm. that are interested in purchasing grain from Vermont and milling it for the farmers here. But in terms of having a very large-scale commercial mill in Vermont, we certainly don't have the grain acreage at this time. Not to say that it wouldn't be possible in the future, but I think we need to work out some of the production issues before we're going to get to that point.
What is it that would sort of drive a farmer to be interested in producing grains and,
mm-hmm.
and go to the expense of getting the equipment in place to do that?
Well, I think there's definitely a strong desire in Vermont to farm. It's it still is an agricultural state, and so I think anybody who is a farmer has a desire to farm the land, and a lot of what a farmer does depends on what can be sold. And if there's a market for milk, which there has been for a really long time and there will continue to be, then somebody would produce milk. But now there's new markets and new potential, and one of those new markets is grain. And since there's such a demand, again, that might interest a farmer in getting into the grain growing business.
Mm-hmm. And what are some of the different kinds of grains?
Yep. So grains grow really well, actually, in Vermont. Most grains like cool climates. Mm-hmm. So wheat, oats, barley, rye are all very cool climate grains that do well in Vermont. We also have been growing sunflowers for oil, and we've also been looking at them for confectionery, for the seed. We have been dabbling in millets, as was mentioned in the video, and corn, of course, and we're working on amaranth as well, and quinoa, investigating those. So a number of grains can be grown here.
And what do farmers that you talk to think about the research that's been going on with grains?
I think it's most farmers are really excited about it, and people are always excited about new opportunities and new potential, and so we've gotten great feedback. We have workshops, a number of workshops during the year, and our attendance has quadrupled over the past 5 years, so the interest is there. People are excited.
And what about the flavor of Vermont grain? Does it taste different?
Yes, it definitely tastes different, and I think if you talk to some of the grain producers, that's one of the most positive feedbacks that they get from customers, is that the grain has a special flavor to it. And of course it's fresh, first of all, but every place creates a unique flavor to the food, and so the Vermont grain does have a unique flavor. And we also grow some different varieties too.
So what's the Northern Grain Growers Association?
The Northern Grain Growers Association is a group of farmers, grain farmers, that established themselves as a formal group about a year ago. And the goal of the group really is to improve and increase the grain industry in Vermont. So they're working together with bakers and consumers and Extension to develop a grain infrastructure here.
Are there parts of the state where it's easier to grow grain than other parts of the state?
Definitely. I think, it's interesting up in northern Vermont, up in the Northeast Kingdom, the historical records show that most farms in Vermont could not grow winter wheat. And now all farms can, because the weather has changed that much. But I think there were some places that were better, such as Addison County. There was a rain shadow there that created great opportunities and climates similar to the plains during some parts of the year. And so their wheat in Addison County, even back in the 1800s, was known as the best and highest quality wheat in the United States. So it does still remain a nice place to grow grains, but the weather continues to challenge us today.
And how much does consumer demand drive how much work is done toward research in wheat?
That's why it's being done. I think Vermont farmers couldn't really compete on the commodity scale, so they're not going to be able to grow grain and sell it like the farmers in Kansas. And the reason that grain growing will be successful in Vermont is because of the wonderful consumers that live here that want to support local and want to buy local grains.
And so it does come down to sort of a bottom line thing with farmers, is if you can, even if you're a smaller crop of wheat, but if you can get more money for it, then it pays.
Definitely.
So for grain production to develop in Vermont, where do you think that the most pressure will come from? Farmers, bakers, consumers?
The consumers. Ultimately, the consumers are going to ask bakers for locally grown grains. The consumers are going to ask the farmers for it. They're going to ask the stores for it. And so as long as that momentum keeps up, I think the market will continue to grow. And
the baker that we saw in the story earlier was really sort of adamant about getting the local product.
Yes, and so, again, business owners as well want local grains, and they know the consumers want it, and so we're working together with those folks to figure out what is it that they actually need in terms of product and quality to make this whole thing go.
And farmers coming up with creative ideas to make it happen as far as sharing equipment?
Definitely. There's a lot of equipment sharing. I think, again, probably one of the things that's holding us back a little bit is the milling, the processing end of things. Not just with wheat to mill it into flour, but in order to sell oats or millets and things like that, you need special equipment to process it. So we're working on that. The Grain Growers Association is working with foundations and other folks to try to get some of that infrastructure here.
Great. Heather, thank you very much.
Thanks.
If you'd like more information about growing grains in Vermont, you can contact Heather at the UVM Extension website, or you can call her at the phone number on your screen. That's our program for today. Thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. We'll see you again next time on Across the Fence.
For a video copy of today's program, call toll-free 1-888-ATF-3430. Across the Fence is brought to you as a public service by University of Vermont Extension, the Vermont Agricultural Experiment Station, and WCAX-TV.